The case, which has been transferred to this division, is filed in Commonwealth of Kentucky by Fred Cowan, Attorney General versus Louisville Crematory and Cemeteries Company, Inc. Your Honor, please carry Hillary for defendants Amos and Copley. Thornton Adams for the Corporation, Louisville Crematory and Cemeteries. Ms. McCormick is here, and Mr. Shackelford. Yes, Your Honor. Any other attorneys that I have not named?
You know, I think when it gets right down to the brass tacks, the evidence is there in the record. It's indisputable. There's a 150-page report that was filed by Phil DeBlasi, who is the archaeologist working for the University of Louisville. You know, he has made his expert, you know, opinion known in that report. You know, there's vast overburials. There are deficiencies in the trust funds. And that's the long and short of it.
Right on top of the dirt pile, plain view in everybody's sight was a skull, intact. And I went back and told the supervisor, I said, hey man, you gotta come look at this. He said, cover it up with a tarp and put it back in the hole.
Here's what's happening. We're going out there and we're having to hide skulls with tarps. So these family members are not seeing that there's other bodies in the dirt that's going to be refilled into the grave. There's lots of bones and bodies.
I heard stories about how they were finding bones in different places. I did contact the Attorney General. At that point, I was stay-at-home mom, so I was able to put some time into it. And I remember contacting the Attorney General, and he did go down and check the grave and said that if he's there, if that was him, he was only buried inches down. But he couldn't guarantee that either. And so at that point, I really did just came to terms with it and just still continue to not go down there and celebrate his life in other ways.
I mean, I was shocked. I was devastated. I mean, you know, to know that possibly all the loved ones was buried on top of my loved one, which is my mom. So it was quite devastating.
He did not purchase that plot, you know, knowing that he was going to have other people on top of him.
It's actually known coast to coast as the nation's most grossly abused cemetery. I mean, you Google Eastern Cemetery, Louisville, Kentucky, you're going to find an article from the LA Times or a newspaper in New York talking about, you know, the horrible things that went on.
I mean, there are people who still own plots that are supposed to be empty, but they're probably not. And I mean, how do you can't really make that right, honestly.
And you had hundreds and thousands of family members coming up wanting to know, once this broke news, is my family buried with somebody else?
Pulled out a loaded .38 caliber revolver and stuck it in my face, probably no more than a foot or two away from right between the eyes. This guy was easily in his 70s, he wasn't in his early 80s, and I could see the chambers were loaded on the pistol.
It's part of my faith. We bury the dead with dignity, and that did not happen.
You know, they walked him out of it, and I thought, no, it's not right. It's not right. They're gonna walk, and nothing's gonna be done.
There's just bones everywhere. The joke was, when we got the investigation going full blown, you couldn't sling a dead cat in Eastern Cemetery without finding a disturbed burial.
We had the bare bones of the story, and then as we kept working, we kept uncovering more and more scraps and more and more scraps, and it's a much, much bigger story than I think anybody could have imagined.
When you would go there, it's like the place just like it wanted help, like it was begging for help.
In it, business, or waiting for it, I mean, it belongs to you. So when you die, it is your property, your estate, it goes to your like her. It is real estate.
Every single one of them is going to be going through one of the hardest times.
Yeah, there's holes in the ground. Yeah, where the cars pass by. Yeah, there's holes in the ground. Yeah, where the bottle high. So where's your angel of redemption? Way up in the sky. So now where's those good old intentions? Yeah, 'cause the bones don't lie. The bones don't lie. The bones don't lie. Another shot of a whiskey. Yeah, another shot of it. Another nail to the casket. Another lonely bed. So drop an egg into the basket. Hair of a dog, you tisket tasket. Here we go, down to the bottom. Here we go, where the bones don't lie. So where's those angels of redemption? Way up in the sky. So now where's those good old intentions? Yeah, 'cause the bones don't lie. The bones don't lie. The bones don't
Eastern Cemetery consists of 29.6 acres of land and is located in the Irish Hill neighborhood of Louisville, Kentucky. Founded in 1843 by two Methodist churches, Eastern and its sister cemeteries, Greenwood and Chardine, were owned by the Louisville Crematory and Cemetery Company for 145 years. Following an investigation by the Attorney General's office in 1989, the company ceased operations, and charges including overburial and grave desecration were brought against 3 of its officials. Only about 16,000 gravestones can be found at Eastern Cemetery, but records exist for over 138,000 burials there. Some sections have been regridded and reused over and over, and some individual graves have been buried as many as 8 times. The defunct cemetery company was placed under court-ordered receivership until 2001, when Maurice Phillips was removed from the position following allegations that he had abandoned his duties and mismanaged cemetery funds.
You know, when I first went over there in 1974, I saw all these sunken graves. And so I was wondering about that. And I talked to my predecessor and then other people at Cave Hill. And the reason that happened is because they didn't require a concrete vault for the casket.
At Eastern Cemetery, they would charge people and get paid to put the concrete vault in. But most of the time they wouldn't put them in. The reason they wouldn't put them in is because they knew they'd be digging there again in the not so distant future.
So as I go through the records, again, I'm doing the research with the records. This is under the court order. I'm acting at checking the graves, and I want to find out what kind of paperwork do we have. And I started seeing this notation OG, OG, OG consistently throughout the records. And it's old grave. They're burying people in old graves.
They'll wait till the casket decomposes. There's no family members, no monument, no flowers on Mother's Day or Easter. And so they would reuse that grave space.
And at some point, they had 10 years worth of graves that hadn't been visited. So they reconcile that with the maps, and they say, okay, Section A, row 26 through row 32, there's only 2 people over there that have been visited. So let's go on and clear all the stones out of there and resell them.
Starting in the 1850s, they systematically start reselling entire sections. They sell individual lots over and over and over again. It's an incredibly complex, and they kept multiple sets of books. But like I said, the standard for burial is 1,000 to 1,100 bodies per acre. It's a 30-acre cemetery. That's what, 30,000 to 40-something thousand bodies, right? We right now, we're not done yet, have 130,000 recorded burials in Eastern Cemetery.
Eastern Cemetery is home to more than 100,000 unmarked and disturbed burials of individuals who entrusted the care of their final remains to a business which considered them expendable. As early as 1858, records indicate multiple burials in the same grave. The practice of overburial and resale of occupied graves became standard procedure for the company until cemetery worker Bob Allen reported it to the Kentucky Attorney General's office in 1989.
So Bob Allen, when he went to work there, he said that these people didn't hide what they were doing. They weren't out there in the middle of the night doing it like I'd always thought, like anyone would think. He said that they did it open, plain as day. Never made excuses, never told anybody to cover anything up. It's just how business was done.
In the years following the investigation, Eastern Cemetery was abandoned. Its grounds have become overgrown, gravestones have been destroyed or stolen, and the chapel, garage, and stone vault have been broken into and vandalized repeatedly.
I think they had the urns where you could stick flowers, and of course back then you brought great quality of things. And he has marble. He has the marble, and the brass and things have been taken. My uncle, who lays there next to him, his things have been removed, and it was so decayed because right in the middle, I have a cousin. Right there, but we were unable to put a marker there because the ground was so trashed up and decayed. So there's an unmarked grave of a relative there right in the middle of them.
Like Mother's Day, Memorial Day weekend, my father would have to take his weed eater and make me a path. That's the only way I would be able to find where she was. He would go first, and then he would tell me, I made you a path, so as soon as you pull in, park on the side, get out, and you'll see my path, and that will lead you to where she's buried.
And he actually went through the files that they still had inside before the building was bricked over and pulled out index cards and tried to lead us in the right direction, even though it was a complete mess out there. We did end up finding her dad, which was my grandpa, Heward, but was unable to find anybody else.
Nobody's here. Nobody's doing anything. You got this huge cemetery right in the middle of Louisville's historic district that we're supposedly so proud of. And look at it. It's an embarrassment. It's shambles.
The care of those at rest in these neglected cemeteries was left up to their families and loved ones, who were taken advantage of in one of the most difficult times of their lives.
My husband and I are just local amateur historians. We've been all over the city. And after a visit to Cave Hill one day, we said, oh, look, right across the wall there's a whole other cemetery. How do you even get into it? Figured out how to go around and get into it. And we're expecting more of what we've just seen, manicured lawns and landscaped trees and beautiful cemetery. And it was not that at all. It was really heartbreaking. A lot of the same names on both sides of the wall. And yet you go from perpetual care to neglect and vandalism.
My guys were just standing there, and the Eastern employees didn't realize that my men were there. So they dug down, hit a grave, maybe a 20-year-old grave. There was a thigh bone, and they thought it was funny, so they just threw it over the wall into Cave Hill.
A red brick wall stretches along the southeast border of Eastern Cemetery. On the other side is Cave Hill Veterans Cemetery, Louisville's oldest and most prominent burial ground. A beautifully kept garden cemetery in the popular style of the mid-19th century, Cave Hill is home to over 5,500 graves of Union and Confederate soldiers. Spanning 296 acres, in 2002, Cave Hill had about 120,000 people interred there, with space remaining for about 22,000 more graves. By comparison, Eastern Cemetery has less than 30 acres and over 138,000 recorded burials.
It wasn't that he had any prior experience with running a cemetery. And, you know, I know he leaned some on Lee Squires. You know, he would try to consult with him and ask, you know, advice and so forth about just day-to-day operational things, or about equipment, or about the guys, you know, who are working there. And they would have conversations. But my dad, you know, may have been just in over his head.
You know, I would talk to Mr. Amos about the burials. I said, how can you have so many spaces still available? And Cave Hill was about, at that time, probably 80% full. We had 300 acres. Eastern was how many acres, you recall?
29.6.
Yeah. I said, how can you still be burying people? He said, oh, we just find spaces, you know.
Understanding. We are sitting here with a known fact that there have to be desecration violations, because you can't put 84,000 people where 22,000 are supposed to be buried. Secondly, there is, in all fairness to the court, an additional issue here where there has been an attempt by the plaintiffs through pleadings to pierce the corporate veil and make the directors and officers of this corporation personally liable, and to prohibit them from resting behind the corporate veil of protection. Based on the simple theory, and the proof of that will show simply that you couldn't have a once a month meeting out there over a period of years and not understand the mathematical equation which has been recited here by me in the last few minutes. That's an element that is a matter of public record, and for anybody not to know that is absolute, unquestioned, gross negligence.
In 1843, parishioners of two churches came together, each donating 7.5 acres of land, and the Methodist burial grounds were formed for the interment of members of those congregations. Articles of incorporation were drafted in 1848 and approved by the General Assembly of Kentucky on the 4th of March, 1854, forming the Eastern Cemetery Company. The charter states that a board of 9 trustees would be nominated, half from each of the 2 founding churches, and that all profits remaining after the cost of payment to officers and laborers, capital improvements, and other expenses would be equally divided between the 2 churches: 4th Street Methodist, now Trinity Temple United Church, and Brook Street Methodist, now Christ United Methodist Church.
And, you know, I heard all along that the Methodist Church was the owner of the property in the cemetery, which makes it even more appalling. I know that all the managers were Methodist, so I assume that's correct. But it was appalling to all of us at Cave Hill.
That what they would do, the operators of the cemetery would take the money, the profits from operating the cemetery, take half of it for the continued operation of the cemetery, and then take the other half and split it amongst these Methodist churches. And this was recorded in the trustees' minutes for as long as I could find in the minute books that I was able to get my hands on. When it came to the court situation, there was actually an attorney who was hired by the Methodist churches, or one of the Methodist churches, who anytime anyone said during the proceedings they tied the cemetery to the churches, it was his job to object that they were not legally tied together, though it's pretty clear that the trustees of the cemetery were all members of these churches. And the proceeds were going there, whether they were part of the same corporation or not.
The board consisted of a lot of elderly men throughout the neighborhood, but they had to be a member of one of those churches in order to be on the board. They would have a board meeting, and I think they got $50 in a chicken dinner when they showed up. And I think some of them had to be woke up before it was over.
And the Methodist Church, I don't think, claims any responsibility for any of it. That's very disturbing to me. And of course, all the family members that, had problems with their loved ones and their graves desecrated.
Absolutely.
And if the Methodists were responsible for it, that's a real shame.
Eastern Cemetery has a history of public concern for overburial and grave desecration. As early as 1885, the Louisville Journal reported on complaints about the burial grounds, citing filthy conditions and graves that were only a few inches deep. In 1912, J.W. Hardin told the Courier-Journal that when he came to visit his parents' final resting place, the grave of William Clark had been placed on top of them. In 1915, a lawsuit was filed against the cemetery by lot holders, alleging that $4,500 had been misappropriated to the beneficiary churches instead of the Perpetual Care Trust Fund. In 1948, Edna McDaniel sued when 4 plots she had purchased, including one her husband was already buried in, were resold by the cemetery.
Mid-19th century, Thomas Shank, he is the guy in the 1850s who was the sexton of the cemetery. Either he or his wife. They kind of swapped off the jobs, all right? Thankfully, she kept the records because she had beautiful handwriting and during that period of time. And I'm pretty certain that this is the guy that discovered that as Louisvillians were moving west during the westward expansion of the United States, okay, the 1850s, he was buying up family lots. So let's say you owned a family lot that you had paid $25 or $30 for, a 10 grave lot, and you had 2 children that were buried there or a couple of family members. Well, you're moving out west. I'll give you $25 for your lot or $15. We really don't have the figure. But what we see was he was buying the lots, and that's kind of convoluted too. They would either be bought back in the name of Eastern Cemetery, or they were bought by Thomas Shanks personally. Louisville was a small town. You would move west, okay? So it was in the paper. You and your family moved west to find your fortune. You've gone to St. Louis. Maybe you wrote a letter back. It would get into the local papers. At that point, old Thomas would go, they're off the scene now. Your whole lot with their 2 or 3 graves would go up for sale. Okay? He was also apparently one of the individuals or the individual that discovered, people aren't coming back and visiting this section. We'll just rebury it completely. So this Thomas Shank starts actually reallocating parts of the cemetery as new sections. We have the old slave grounds has completely disappeared. The cheap willow, the elm tree division. There are entire sections of that cemetery that are gone.
When I've gone out to Greenwood, which is half the size of Eastern, and basically the same conditions.
So we were at Greenwood and we were walking around, and there literally are bones on the surface of the ground. You can walk around and be like, well, that's part of a fibula. That's like an occipital, the back of the skull, like right there by that tree.
Greenwood feels like it wants to be left alone. It feels defeated. It's a sad place.
In 1903, the Board of Trustees of Eastern Cemetery loaned the Union Land Development Company, composed primarily of prominent African-American undertakers, $20,000 for the purchase of lands and mapping out of a new cemetery, Greenwood. 3 iterations of maps exist for Greenwood Cemetery, 1903, 1932, and 1984. These maps depict a majority of the grounds having been reburied. In some cases, entire sections of Greenwood completely disappear, and in others, new sections have been carved out of old ones.
Many of the black undertakers formed a corporation, and they borrowed money to start Greenwood Cemetery, okay? The reason I know this is from reading the minutes of Eastern Cemetery's board of directors. They had Stone Street and Ford lay out the cemetery. The roads, this was rural Jefferson County at the time, were unpaved. And in the summer, they wrote a letter to the Board of Aldermen saying that the dirt roads, the dust, because this is when you were following a horse-drawn hearse to the cemetery. The dust would choke the mourners, and then in the wintertime, the mud was a quagmire. The members of Eastern Cemetery had so much political pull that they kept the road from being macadamized. As a result of that, or at least the Black Undertaker Consortium went under. The property was bought at a sheriff's auction. There are minutes that state they hired an individual who was not directly associated with the Eastern Cemetery to buy Greenwood Cemetery at the sheriff's auction. They did. They brought the deed to the cemetery, and it was transferred within a day or two to Eastern Cemetery Corporation. And then on top of that all, the note that was outstanding by the Black Undertakers, the operators of Eastern Cemetery called the note, and they wanted the cash for the loan.
In May 1935, the Eastern Cemetery Company built Kentucky's first crematory at a cost of around $8,000. As demand grew, the newly renamed Louisville Crematory and Cemetery Company cornered the market on cremations and continued plans for expansion. In September 1957, construction began on a new structure in the back of Eastern Cemetery, which would house the offices, chapel, crematorium, and columbarium at the cost of $79,737. The construction of the building and a new access road was directly over what had previously been the old Colored Oddfellows section, and the remains of numerous burials were shifted into a condensed area which would later be redesignated as Section 19, or Babyland. In 1984, Paul and Shirley Barr sued Louisville Crematory and Cemetery Company when their son Michael couldn't be buried in a plot they had purchased in 1979 because it was already occupied. The family was awarded $10,000, and the court determined that the defendants had done a sloppy job, recommending a survey be done on all graves sold pre-need. In a board meeting on February 27, 1987, the Barr case was discussed. It is clear from the minutes of this meeting, the board understood they were going to have more problems with reserved graves and needed to secure additional burial space for the future. Present were Clifford B. Amos, president of the board of directors, and Charles Alexander, executive director in charge of day-to-day operations.
Charlie was nice. He could be very, very nice. As far as running a company, no, he depended. He wasn't great at management. He wasn't great. We all knew our jobs and we all kind of did them. He was very good at manipulating the guys.
You put that grave there no matter what. I mean, that's their policy. They're not going to call a funeral director and tell a funeral director, the grave you just called in for so-and-so is not there. We got to do this and that. They're not going to do that. You know, they're not going to talk to the funeral director. They're not going to tell family. They're not going to tell nobody. You put the grave there, whatever it costs. I mean, if you're digging through one, you know, dig the grave deep enough, put skeletal remains back in, make the burial on top of it.
Louisville Crematory and Cemetery Company office staff included Barbara Ray, bookkeeper since 1987, and Beth Selch, receptionist since 1984. Bob Allen worked alongside two other gravediggers, Ronnie Aubrey and J.R. Miles. For years, Bob Allen complained to his supervisor, Charles Alexander, that every time he dug a grave, he found signs of a previous burial. Finally, in 1988, Allen went before the board of directors with his concerns. A policy statement about the problem was to have been issued which would have protected the gravediggers from legal repercussions, but no such document ever materialized.
You know, and the family, I was bringing it up, you know, and he said, well, I'll approach the board with it. I'll talk to Amos and Copley about it. I'll get some answers and I'll get back to y'all. It never happened.
When the guys started coming in probably early 89, talking to us finally, saying, here's what's happening. We're going out there and we're having to hide skulls with tarps. So these family members are not seeing that there's other bodies in the dirt that's going to be refilled into the grave. There's lots of bones and bodies. And we told them point blank, we don't care what the board members are telling you. We don't care what Charlie's telling you. What you're doing is illegal.
Charlie had it behind his seat. He had a sign that said, "Don't worry, be happy." And we kept on talking and talking. I thought, yeah, you're going to be happy. Because I'm done. I'm done with it, you know. So I got off that day at noon. I come home, and the first thing I did was call the Attorney General's office.
The AG's office sends an accountant in to look at the books, and this other guy turns out to be a detective for the Attorney General's office. And he just kind of hangs out with the guys for 2 weeks. And literally, there are McDonald's bags under the front seat with femur heads and human bones, and there's just bones everywhere.
On the morning of Tuesday, May 30th, 1989, Jim Caldwell entered the cemetery offices under the guise of performing the annual tax audit, along with Rick Morris, an auditor from the AG's office.
Jim Caldwell came in with Rick. Rick was an auditor with the Attorney General's office, and Jim Caldwell came in, and immediately Barbara and I knew he was not an auditor.
Jim, the first time I met him, Jim, you could see the cop coming out of him. I mean, you know, he was strictly business.
I knew he was a police officer the minute he walked in. Nobody wears brown polyester except for a police officer.
When I met Jim for the first time, he was wearing jeans and a white t-shirt and a leather shoulder holster with a .357 Magnum with a 6 or an 8-inch barrel.
Under normal circumstances, graves were always dug the day prior to a funeral. But after Jim Caldwell's arrival, Charles Alexander instructed the ground crew to hold off on preparations for the burial of James Dudgeon, which was scheduled for the following day.
He told Ronnie Jr. not to dig it while they're there. He said, wait. Okay. He said, while they're in the cemetery, don't do it, wait. So they dug it the next day. It's up there by the office.
There was going to be a burial in the Rose Garden right outside of my office the following day, and they knew they would find something. They absolutely knew. They always did. So it was going to be set up to where Jim Caldwell came up when they had dug the grave.
They hid all kinds of previous burials in there. It was loaded on the dump truck, taken back and dumped. It was just normal procedure. You know, they dug through whatever it was, went on the truck, dumped it, covered it up to make the burial the next day.
From what Bob Allen had told me, that specific burial, there were, I believe, 3 to 4 bodies in the grave where Mr. Dudgeon was supposed to be placed. The Attorney General's office came back in 2 days later with actually carrying almost a backpack filled with bones.
Around 7 a.m. Thursday, June the 1st, 1989, Bob Allen unlocked the front gate and led Jim Caldwell back to the stone vault. Caldwell entered with a flashlight and found what was later determined to be a human tibia on one of the stone shelves. Later, Charles Alexander told Caldwell that the cemetery was very, very old, and unidentified bodies were laying in some locations. When remains are found in what is thought to be an empty grave, the procedure is to allow for the new burial anyway.
Jim, when the morning he come in there and I turned things over to him, he went to the coroner's office to make sure it was human. I know he told me one time, he said, I'll put yellow tape around this whole building and lock every one of them up.
After taking the remains to the county coroner, Jim Caldwell returned to conduct a more thorough investigation. He found human remains in a golf cart, a toolbox, some strewn on the ground near the office building, others in a garbage can, while some remains were discovered rolled up in a fast food bag stashed in a truck's glove compartment.
I mean, I think they were told, you know, if you're out there, find something, you know, pick it up. but some of it wound up in the pickup truck, some of it wound up on the backhoe. It's just where people went through and they picked it up, not trying to hide it, but they knew it was out there on the grounds.
When the archaeologist went out there, he discovered 244 bodies, bones, evidencing bodies that were either in the shed, a workplace somewhere, or down in the basement housing the facilities there. You would think if you go to a lumber yard that you're going to see scrap lumber around, but I would not think that under this particular type of business you would see the items regularly controlled and entered into, bandied around in that fashion. So I would hope that there needs not to be much proof put on in that regard. Those facts are so self-evident that perhaps even res ipsa wouldn't apply, but it's a similar situation to that. How can you say that the directors are not personally liable for things right in front of their face they have ignored over a period of time?
The Kentucky Attorney General's office brought charges against the then 145-year-old company and its 3 chief officers, Clifford B. Amos, Robert Copley, and Charles Alexander. All 3 men pled innocent in July 1989 after a grand jury indicted them on over 60 counts, including corpse abuse, grave desecration, improper handling of burial payments, and failure to keep adequate funds in perpetual care trust accounts. If convicted on all criminal charges, Louisville Crematory and Cemetery Company faced fines up to $1.1 million, and Amos, Copley, and Alexander were subject to sentences of up to 268 years in prison.
It was in total contradiction of everything my dad stood for. He was just such an upstanding type of individual. I certainly could imagine that it could have taken place without his knowledge or awareness. He really probably should not have been in the role that he was in. He did not know anything about cemeteries.
An injunction filed July the 21st, 1989, prohibited any new burials at Eastern or Greenwood, except for the 3,200 pre-need plots already sold. The order also stated every burial would have to first be examined by an archaeologist from the University of Louisville.
A relatively large percentage of the graves that have been sold as reserves, as we investigate them, the grave right behind you, as a matter of fact, was occupied by 3 individuals. And then by the time we got to the 3rd individual, all we had was the pelvic region. And they had been just cut, and basically a third of the individual had been cut off with a backhoe.
Bill DeBossi's incredible, man. The knowledge that guy's got is incredible. They've used him because when the investigation was going on, they had to have somebody that was qualified to go in and check that grave to make sure it could be used.
I was involved with the investigation under the Attorney General. The court order said, you people are operating a cemetery, but you can't violate the law. So to keep you from violating the law, we're going to have an archaeologist come in here, and every time you open a grave, he's going to look at it to find out if it's previously occupied.
Phil DeBlasi began his investigation of Eastern and Greenwood cemeteries in July of 1989, digging up about 2 graves a day, usually side by side with Jim Caldwell and Bob Allen. By November, DeBlasi reported checking about 70 sites, and only a few failed to produce remains from previous burials.
As we were digging the grave for Esther C. Nelson, we encountered the pelvic region and lower extremities of individual 1.
In one case, at a family member's request, the remains of Jesse W. Melson and Ivy Irene Despain were disinterred and identified for relocation to another cemetery. During the excavation of the grave, remains of more than a dozen previous burials were found.
We have individuals, these are all the 10 of these that we've indicated to you are John or Jane Doe. They were buried prior to 1870. The individuals I'm going to point out now are individuals who are on the modern grid.
The redesignation of cemetery sections is clear as the modern burials face the road, but the ancient burials are facing east in continuity with Christian burial traditions in the 19th century.
There are approximately, at first there was intended to be, and for a while was maintained, a perpetual care fund by the cemetery. That perpetual care fund, I am informed by witnesses who are prepared here to testify, but will do so by affidavit, is about $100,000 short. Now, the nature of a perpetual care fund is that when one purchases a burial site in the cemetery, a certain portion of that purchase price goes to setting up a fund that theoretically the interest and income from that fund over the years will be sufficient to maintain cutting the grass in the cemetery and even maintain it in years after the cemetery becomes full.
The Perpetual Care Fund for Eastern Cemetery was estimated to be missing over $117,000, which by law was to be used for the upkeep of graves, monuments, and cemetery grounds. The cemetery had also been illegally charging family members for annual care, although these services were never rendered.
You shouldn't have to do that. If the money is being put into the trust fund like it should have been, there wouldn't be a need to charge the family, or whether it was legal or not, probably not, to charge these families $50 a year, $75, $100 a year to maintain their graves.
After building Kentucky's first crematory, Eastern Cemetery held a monopoly on the cremation business throughout the 20th century. On August the 8th, 1966, the University of Louisville Medical School sent over several cadavers for cremation, and by the 1980s, Eastern Cemetery was solely responsible for all medical waste cremations from U of L.
We receive bodies every year. If you donate your body to the medical school, they use your body for science. After a year, your body is cremated and it is returned to the family. That is what's supposed to happen.
Jim Caldwell was upset with the way the med schools were treating the human remains that were coming in for cremation. There were 20 or 30 sets of remains at a time. They were supposed to come back individual boxes and individual. And I understand that they were coming back kind of mixed.
The year that we got bodies over there, a body came out of the box, the box that was sent over it. That box, Bob Allen came up and got me, and he said, we have a problem. When I went downstairs, there were probably, in that box, 5 heads, 22 toes, and 18 mice in one box.
They were accused of cremating more than one body at the same time. So technically, if you cremate parts of 2 or 3 people from a med school medical waste as one, is that breaking the law?
And I said, stop what we're doing. I'm calling the Attorney General's office, finding out what we need to do. Jim Caldwell had to come over. We had to open each and every box because each body is supposed to be returned to the family, a whole body. Mm-hmm. In one of the boxes, we found probably 15 babies that had been thrown in a box. These babies were no doubt over 365 grams. They were not abortions. They were a lot of them were babies that should have had proper burials. It was declared that everything in those boxes were okay. Basically, the Attorney General's office did not in any way, shape, or form want to take on University of Louisville Medical School.
Over the course of the investigation, cemetery workers told Jim Caldwell that about 70 infants' bodies were buried less than a foot beneath the surface in Section 19, or Babyland.
And a couple times I was told to come to court to testify about Babyland, some of the things. I get down there, no, they don't need you. You know, we're not going to get to that spot. We're not going to get there. You know, it's like they don't want to hear, man. You know, they don't want to hear it.
Babyland, as we call it, Section 19, where there are several babies buried there. A lot of them still don't have tombstones. They still have just the plastic pieces of paper. And a lot of those babies were buried maybe 9 inches deep, maybe 12 inches deep.
Caldwell found that infants were routinely buried in wooden containers constructed of 1-inch pine boards, and the identified graves ranged from 10 to 24 inches in depth.
I did a disinterment there and literally took my trowel and scraped the grass off and hit the lid of the wooden box the stillborn was buried in.
The babies were absolutely, I actually have pictures of one baby, and like I said, that was put into a jar and put into a grave, maybe 9 inches deep.
I have made a couple burials back there. All of us did. Ronnie did some, JR's done some, I've done a couple. But I know one I did when I was digging the grave, because the little baby graves you dig by hand with a shovel. You know, you don't need no, because you're usually going to go 1 by 2, 1 foot wide and 2 foot long. Maybe, 2 foot deep, 1.5 foot, 2 foot deep. But when I dug, I didn't get that far. When I hit a leg bone, pretty good sized femur. And I just stopped right there. I said, no, this is it, man. I stopped. I went and get Charlie, I said, you ain't got that far to walk. Come out there and take a look. So he walked out, he looked, he said, pick it up, finish digging the grave deep enough to get by and put that back in there on the bottom.
Ada Hurt, a longtime member of Christ United Church, accepted a seat on the board of directors in 1974, and in 1980 took a full-time job as office manager at Eastern Cemetery. Ada's daily responsibilities included sales of burial monuments and billing for the annual and lifetime care plans.
I had a lady that came to my hospital room and offered to take care of it, as she put it. And at that point, I had had a really terrible delivery. So I was just at a loss of what to do. So I let her take care of it, take care of the burial. And yes, I can still see her face today because I think she knew what was happening down there.
In the mid-1980s, Ada Hurt began soliciting the mothers of stillborn babies while still recovering in their hospital rooms, offering them closure through the burial of their child at Eastern Cemetery for the very reasonable cost of $75. She would sit bedside and write out the bill of sale on a hospital napkin.
Well, she came down as a representative of Eastern. And so she just came in the room and said, she did the normal, I'm sorry what happened, blah, blah, blah. And then said, for $75, we can take care of the burial. And at that point, I had a rough delivery and I didn't know what to do. So I let her. And as soon as I was able to, I went down there. I went where I thought he was buried.
Because she had, talked to this lady for a couple hours and shared the most intimate details of her life with this woman who seemed to be so nice and caring, to sit there and listen, that, why wouldn't, who would fake something like that? Who would, make up that stuff to deceive you? Who would act like that and have an ulterior motive when you've just been through so much? The people of the Louisville Cemetery and Crematory Incorporated would. That's who would. That's who did. And because of that, she chose to have her baby buried there and felt good about it for a very short time. Needless to say, when she stopped going because she heard of what would happen there.
I saw it on the news. And I thought that nightmare of a delivery just got worse. And that's when I saw that was my first thought. But this nightmare it just became worse.
Who in the hell takes advantage of a person in that situation? What's wrong with somebody that, and not even somebody, a business? It was their practice. That's how they conducted their business. I'm preying on people like her, who every single one of them is going to be going through one of the hardest times of their lives.
My big thing was just not being able to go down there And I also just felt like a fool for a long time, thinking, oh, I've been going down there, and who's there, if anyone? And it just felt dirty.
After the news of the overburial of Eastern Cemetery broke, the families of those resting there were outraged. Attorney General Fred Cowan said more than 200 people called to file complaints or seek information within the first week of the indictment.
You have to understand, you had hundreds and thousands of family members coming up wanting to know, once this broke news, is my family buried with somebody else? Is my grave still available? No, your grave's not available. Your grave's not available because there's probably 13 people in your grave also. And do you get a refund on this? No, you don't. The cemetery doesn't have any money to pay you back. Well, I want to move my husband out of, okay, well, you can do that. But you have to pay an archaeologist or an investigator to identify the body. Plus, you have to buy a grave at another cemetery.
We were out in the cemetery doing an exhumation, and this pickup truck came, and one of the crew members from the cemetery realized who it was. This guy pulls up, sticks a double-barrel shotgun out the window at us, at which point everybody's kind of like, diving for cover. And he said he wanted to know where the boys were, where his children were. And then he drove off.
I think that really the entire staff at the cemetery that's been out there now, from the receiver as well as the grounds people as well as the office staff there, have tried with tremendous courage to deal with the overwhelming problems at that cemetery.
When we were still working and cremating people, I had to lock the front door. Them girls left. They couldn't take it no more. I mean, the phone calls were unreal. Stress. People beating on the door that, the only thing they know is what they read in the paper. They didn't know that, I'm still there, Beth's still there, Barbara's still there, trying to keep the place going. I mean, why? I don't know, because there wasn't no future for it, but I just felt obligated.
That's why we stayed. We felt an obligation to try to deal with these families on some sort of level. You had families bringing weapons up there. I don't know if anybody else has told you that, but you had families bringing weapons up. They were angry. I certainly would be if it had happened to me or my father's dead and buried. And they were very angry and they were very frustrated. And there was not any answers we could give them. The Attorney General's office didn't want to talk to them. They were sorry they had ever gotten in the middle of this. They were sorry any of this had ever, they wished all this would just go away.
After the removal of Charles Alexander and the resignation of all the remaining board members, the cemetery company was placed in receivership. In October of 1991, Beth Selch was appointed to oversee the company by the court, only days after her marriage to Jim Caldwell.
Jim and Beth Caldwell. Jim getting better together with Beth Selch. She was the secretary. She was a very becoming young lady. And it was kind of funny because you'd watch the funeral directors and they were all kind of sniffing around and being nice and bringing her coffee and stuff like this. And then, these are guys that are making big bucks. They're driving around great big Mercedes-Benzes and stuff like this. But old Jim, he pulls it through. He ends up marrying her.
And when I went to court, I had gotten married. And of course, that was... It was going to be not that good on news anymore because I had actually married Jim and it wasn't the illicit affair that they were trying to say we were having. And Judge Johnstone, I will never forget this. I went in and he said, okay, he said, Ms. Selch, I said, I've had a name change. And you heard 22 attorneys actually be quiet.
Jim Caldwell resigned from the Attorney General's office under pressure from his superiors after the investigation of Eastern Cemetery. He began working alongside Beth, positively identifying dozens of bodies disinterred by concerned family members for burial in other cemeteries.
Yes, sir. My name's Jim Caldwell. I've been doing examination of graves out there at Eastern Cemetery.
I did not realize until relatively recently the number of disinterments that Jim was involved with after I had left. He was in quotes, positively identifying individuals, and I find that extremely disturbing. I don't think he was capable of doing it.
Unable to sell any more graves, and with the cremation business rapidly declining, Beth couldn't maintain adequate funds to upkeep the grounds, compensate employees, or pay utility bills. Finally, in 1992, the gas and electric were shut off for the final time, and Beth Caldwell stepped down as receiver.
Me and Jim was trying to do everything we could. I was trying to run the backhoe. He was trying to watch for me. And it just got to the point where, I went back to the office, and one of the funeral directors from Indiana called and going to bring a body over. And Beth said, he'll be here shortly. I said, okay, I'll go down and open the door. Well, they turned the gas off, and they turned the electric off. So the dude shows up to the back door, and I go up and tell her, I said, well, we're not going to do nothing. I said, because I can't get the door open. We don't have no electric, and we don't have no gas. The only thing I regret to this day, that place stuck a toe on me. When I went to work up there, I had blonde hair. When I left there, I had gray hair. Threats, the people treating you like a dog, we turned into the criminal. We stayed to help, and the criminals walked free.
On August 26, 1991, the criminal case against Clifford Amos, Robert Copley, and Charles Alexander was dismissed after finishing a 6-month pretrial diversion program. As part of the conditions, the 3 men were to no longer be employed by the cemetery company, nor participate in its operations. Defense lawyers have contended that Caldwell first came to Eastern Cemetery in May 1989 without a search warrant and intentionally misled cemetery staff. Much of the evidence and testimony was deemed inadmissible because Caldwell had been let onto the grounds before business hours by cemetery worker Bob Allen. Over $100,000 in cemetery funds was paid in legal fees for the defense, leaving nothing to compensate victims in a class action lawsuit against the cemetery company. A statement issued by the Attorney General's office expressed that the prosecution agreed to resolve the criminal case not because of the challenge to Caldwell's methods, but because the defendants were elderly and had never been in trouble before.
His life was, solid. He was just this solid person who believed in doing the right thing, not the wrong thing. And there was no motive for him to do the wrong thing. And that's why I still believe that he was innocent, of wrongdoing in this scenario where wrong things were done.
The hearing down at Judge Corey's court stopped short of going to a conclusion because the criminal case was resolved without any criminal conviction whatsoever.
Well, Your Honor, let me say this. The criminal case is not yet resolved. In fact, we have some evidence that maybe some of the terms of the pretrial diversion agreement may have in fact been violated. There was a pretrial diversion agreement entered. That case will, I think the end of the pretrial diversion agreement is August 13th. It's our understanding that there could be some problems with compliance by the defendants.
The only term of the pretrial diversion agreement, as I recall it, was that none of them would suffer a conviction.
No, they were also not to...
Let me finish. You're right. That they would not suffer a conviction by August 13th or whatever the date was, and that they would not go down to the cemetery. And that was it. And on that basis, the 60-count indictment was dismissed.
The Attorney General's office didn't fully disclose what they were there to do. Therefore, they were there under false pretenses, which made all of the evidence and everything else worthless.
When the indictment come down, they were taken out of there. They hired Frank Haddad's law firm. I think they used cemetery money. And they walked them through the book, and they didn't even stay in jail. They walked them out of it. And I thought, no, it's not right. It's not right. They're going to walk, and nothing's going to be done.
We went through all of the legal machinations, all the pretrial hearings. We were ready for the trial date. We met I was there because I was expected to testify every time. The trial date turned out to be a pretrial hearing in which the judge ripped the AG's office a new asshole and explained to them what a warrantless search was and threw the entire case out the window.
They did. They had an excellent attorney, and they had money. And when they were actually charged with the crimes, they walked through the jail system but never spent 1 minute. They didn't even have to be bonded out of jail. And never paid back 1 penny. Nothing ever happened to them. Nothing.
Mr. Alexander freely and voluntarily gave his consent to give a statement on May 31st. He signed a written waiver giving his consent. He gave, in fact, a tape-recorded statement. When he was asked about the rest, could he consent on behalf of the other staff members to talk to Mr. Caldwell, who had fully and completely and truthfully identified who he was, he said, Mr. Alexander, that is, that he would have to call the board of directors. He, in fact, did in fact talk to Mr. Cobley, who did, in fact, give consent. Consent then throughout, as you will read in our response, was obtained either verbally and or in written form every single day out there. To hold this thing up any longer, I think, would be a travesty. This case has been going on for 2 years. It is very important, I think, that we have a resolution of the case.
They went on just forever asking questions that just trying to get anything they could to where this would go away in the court. And it did. The three men charged with these crimes, Mr. Amos, Mr. Kopp, and Mr. Alexander, never spent 1 day in jail. Not 1 day.
I don't know what was going on, but somebody was covering up something because they had Beth and Barbara do a sworn deposition. Them girls worked in the office. They found the books and stuff and answered the phone. They wasn't out on that ground. They didn't see them bones in the grave. They didn't see people getting dug through and pounded on. They didn't once, through the whole investigation, get me, Ronnie, or JR on a sworn deposition. Finally, I told them, I said, I want a meeting with the Attorney General's office. I said, I want to find out why, this is going on. I think that they did not want us from the ground crew to tell, because they done knew where that case was going. They knew it wasn't going to go nowhere. They're going to shaft Jim Caldwell, and they did. Because he come in there without a search warrant. They hammered on him, and found he resigned.
Well, yes, sir, you've been trying to get a word in there. Your Honor, I'm Maurice Phillips. I'm funeral director at Portland Memorial Chapel. The one thing that hasn't really been brought out here is that most people that are buried or that buy cemetery property use it for people. That's the reason they bought it. The least expensive cemetery property that you can buy in Louisville. I have a lot of clients who have bought property there on pre-arrangement, or even the husband buried there and they reserve a grave space for the wife. These people don't have the money to go ahead and buy another piece of property at another place. They had that money there to buy it in the first place. They don't have the money to go out and obtain an attorney to seek relief at a later date. They have somebody in their family who's died. They have to do something about it right then. There's not the 2 or 3 days. What we have been doing is having Mr. Caldwell and Mr. Allen check out the grave space where people already have a piece of property. And they say whether the grave space is good, whether to use it, they'll approach the grave space. Can we continue to work on that basis? It's been working for the last few years.
One day I was at Greenwood Cemetery and this gentleman walks up and he says, I'm Maurice Phillips. I'm the overseer of this cemetery. And it kind of raised a red flag with me. And I said, well, what are you overseeing? This is the first time I've ever laid eyes on you. And he says, oh, well, I appreciate everything you all are doing down here. This helps us stretch the money a little bit further. And I said, what money? And he said, oh, I get money from the state to maintain the cemeteries. I'm the overseer.
He had this old beat-up Dodge van. He would go and pick up the guys from Dismas Charities. At that time, they were using Eastern Cemetery equipment to mow the cemetery.
And I questioned where was the money going, because we were using volunteer labor. We were using money from my discretionary account at City Hall to maintain the equipment. So where was the money going? And so I started asking questions, and I really didn't like the answers I was getting.
I know he was accused of mismanaging money. I thought it was small potatoes. I thought it was maybe $3,000 or $4,000. I hear now that the numbers were much larger than that.
In the spring of 1997, the court appointed Maurice Phillips receiver over the 3 cemeteries which had been abandoned for nearly 5 years since the resignation of Beth Caldwell. In March of 1998, Maurice Phillips had tons of dirt and construction debris dumped on about a 1/4 acre of marked and unmarked graves in Section 4 of Eastern Cemetery. Phillips reported he needed the dirt for filling sinkholes and open grave shafts left by disinterment, and for grading the ground where burials were too close to the surface. The debris came from a condemned distillery nearby on Payne Street, which was being demolished.
Then we got a phone call saying there was piles of debris. It wasn't dirt, debris. So we rode over there, and there's piles of rock and brick and wood. And someone said, well, we were trying to fill into where these graves had fallen in. But that's garbage. You're dumping garbage here.
Mo had a backhoe and he had a dump truck. And so he went over and talked to the contractor and said, look, I'll haul off your dirt as you guys are doing all this construction. Got a place to dump it. You guys give me this amount and I'll take care of it.
There's somebody doing some work somewhere and he's letting them dump over there for so much a load. And I understand that he was getting paid per truckload that they brought in there.
Well, I was getting answers that this Mr. Phillips was given this money to maintain 3 cemeteries, Eastern, Chardine, and Greenwood. Chardine's a very small cemetery, so it wasn't much to maintain that, but Greenwood was massive and Eastern was massive. When I looked at the records, I was shocked to see that money was being punched out of ATMs at 2 o'clock in the morning at 4th and Oak, and 1 o'clock in the morning at 18th and Broadway, which is why I raised a red flag and said, no one's cutting cemeteries that time of night. Something's going on with this money, which then in turn led me to the Commonwealth Attorney's Office to start asking questions.
On February the 14th, 2001, Maurice Phillips was removed by the court following allegations by the Attorney General's office that he had abandoned his duties and mismanaged cemetery funds. In July, Phillips was indicted by a Jefferson County grand jury and charged with 26 counts of theft and 25 counts of forgery. Between January 1999 and February 2001, Phillips stole or misspent at least $98,541 of cemetery money, making deposits in 6 bank accounts held at L&N Credit Union by Phillips and his wife. Among the alleged transfers was $19,796 from the State Transportation Cabinet for land purchased from Chardine Cemetery to widen 7th Street Road. 2 of the accounts in question were closed immediately after a restraining order was issued to freeze Phillips' assets.
I gave every bank record to the Commonwealth Attorney's Office, reported to him about the issue of using this crematorium. We would receive phone calls over to Chardine. Chardine backs up to a neighborhood. We would receive phone calls in my office where they would call us and say, somebody was back there at 2 o'clock in the morning digging a grave. And I was like, what? And we'd go out there and there would be a fresh grave. So I explained to Dave Stengel what I do believe is that this man is trying to run some type of cemetery business and burying people and charging families for it. And there was not supposed to be any burial in those cemeteries.
On July the 24th, 2001, Phillips was booked at the Jefferson County Jail, but was released on his own recognizance later that day. Maurice Phillips died July the 29th, 2005, with no resolution to the charges that had been brought against him. There has been no receiver appointed by the court for the 3 cemeteries since.
But somewhere along the line, there was a hope to have a not-for-profit corporation created, working with volunteers to see if it could be maintained. I assume that is not met with any success, Mr. Shackelford. No, it has not, Your Honor.
With no one left to oversee the cemetery, break-ins to the chapel, garage, and the stone vault became frequent. Hundreds of gravestones were toppled over, and century-old monuments were destroyed. Brass nameplates were pried off of gravestones and sold as scrap metal. Fires were set throughout the basement and even inside the incinerators themselves.
I think it was also a really convenient place for teenagers in the Highlands that wanted to come party and, you know, do drugs, drink, whatever, to come and do it because, you know, 28 acres, it wasn't hard to find a private, quiet little spot where nobody was going to see them, especially with the grass as tall as it was and the trees and bushes as overgrown as they were.
I do remember seeing the broken into and littered crematorium, and I remember seeing the vases of ashes being scattered and that sort of thing. So I do remember that, and I do remember hearing complaints from someone like A.D. Porter Sr., African-American funeral director, who actually lived in the neighborhood adjacent, Cherokee Triangle. And I do remember meeting with him, as I recall, and always trying to conjure up ways that money and care could be provided to what was essentially an abandoned and bankrupt cemetery.
The chapel and offices located in the back of Eastern Cemetery were broken into and vandalized countless times over the following years. The walls filled with graffiti, and the cremains stored in the columbarium were stolen, dumped out, or destroyed. On July the 28th, 2003, Professor de Blasi petitioned the court and recovered and moved 244 sets of urns, some unlabeled or containing multiple sets of cremains.
Phil at some point went over to the columbarium and noticed that people had broken in. And when he walked in, he went to the area where the columbarium was, which the columbarium is basically an ornate glass shelving system. And people could, when they had a relative cremated, they had nice little bronze urns. People had smashed the glass, they had gotten the urns and dumped out the ashes on the floor.
You know, this is her mom. So I call her up on the telephone, and I'll be honest with you, by the time I was done with the conversation, I was crying too. And I was like, I'm not letting this happen again, okay? So I went to the judge, went to the Attorney General's office, they got a court order, and we brought all the cremated sets of remains here.
So Phil started packing them out. And to put in perspective, he had a full-size van. And these little urns, being that they're brass or bronze or what have you, they probably weigh 8 to 10 pounds. The cremains inside them probably weigh 3 pounds. He loaded up the van 3 times, completely full, packed them down to U of L, and unpacked them all in a day. That's how much it meant to him, that no more got dumped out. These are people that he had no connection to. That's the person he is. That's how he thinks.
What we had was we had a couple dates set up, and they could call here, and what they would do is they would come in and they would sign an affidavit that said they were the nearest next of kin, and we would get them. We would go get their ashes, and we would bring them out on one of the steel carts, and we would give them to them.
He was able to, over the course of the last 10 or 15 years, he's been able to contact the families, and I think that to date he's almost gotten half of them reunited with the families, so they've come and picked them up, which is huge.
In a court order issued February the 14th, 2001, the University of Louisville Program of Archaeology took possession of the written records for Eastern, Greenwood, and Chardin cemeteries, which included burial index cards, day books, range books, and maps, some dating as far back as 1843.
He got a ton of records. He found all kinds of records. And he took all those down to U of L with him. And he, at some point, a lady who was critically ill, who had family at Eastern, came to him and she's like, look, I've got $50,000 I want to leave to Eastern, and I want to put that towards getting the grass cut and maintaining it. And Phil says, all due respect, Dad may cut the grass for 1 year, and the next year it's all going to be back. And he's like, long term, where that money would best serve the cemetery is to set up an endowment for the records, which she listened and trusted him enough to follow his lead on that. And with that, the records have been preserved, and they're being put into a digital form a little bit every year with students working on it.
We're going to scan all of the records so that, because the paper is acid, and literally people are disappearing off the bottom of the page. And, to me, that's probably all that was ever written about that human being.
25 years after the news of overburial broke at Eastern Cemetery, Andy Harpole decided something had to be done. He formed the Friends of Eastern Cemetery based on the belief that those buried within the cemetery walls should receive the perpetual care they not only paid for, but deserve.
The Friends of Eastern Cemetery is a really great group. You have a lot of incredible people who care a lot, and that's an incredible basis, I think, for what we're trying to do. Is having that group of people who really are passionate and care. And when they hear the stories of these families, they are more compelled to want to do more. And I just think that's a great quality to have in a group of people.
I've been involved in different volunteer groups. This is the real deal. They're not doing this to get anything out of it. And they work so hard when they're there. I just feel like it's one of those groups where you can see progress being made. And they're all in for the right reasons.
There's lots of things you can do volunteer-wise that may be a little bit more, self-gratifying or quicker results. And just the fact that it's a cemetery, I tell people, I'll be talking to my dad or whoever, I'll be walking in the cemetery, be like, what are you doing? I'm just walking in the cemetery. Like, why are you walking in a cemetery? So, it's a different kind of people, I think, that are willing to do this.
I think fundamentally everybody has this kind of empathy for what happened there. And we kind of see a reflection of an idea that I've heard mirrored a lot that I believe is that you can tell a lot about a society by the way it treats its dead. And so it's a fundamentally important ritual to have, and it hasn't been upheld. So one of the ways that we describe ourselves is that we're caretakers for a cemetery that doesn't have a caretaker.
On December the 3rd, the Friends of Eastern Cemetery was incorporated as a non-profit organization. The group hosts a number of events annually, including historical tours led by Joe Berndt, preservation training seminars taught by nationally recognized expert Jonathan Appel, and flagging ceremonies on Memorial and Veterans Days. In addition to general landscaping and maintenance, the volunteer group also repair and reset toppled monuments and clean eroded gravestones using a non-corrosive D2 biological solution.
Well, the very first time I went there, it was just a vast variety of people doing anything and everything you could possibly think of. And everybody was welcoming. We were all there for the same purpose, just to see what we could do to help. And it was spent all day there, just cutting grass, raking, trimming, for hours. You don't even realize how long you're there until at the end of the day, you're like, really? It's 5 o'clock.
Every time you show up and the same people are there again, you're like, oh, thank God, they're going to stay, because you never know. And it really is a community effort. You need a lot of people.
No, the upkeep that's going on now, it's helpful, and it I'm sure it lifts up other people's spirits.
When I started with Friends of Eastern Cemetery, every grave that I came across that had that Cunningham name on it, I would just cry. I'm like, that's mine. That's mine. If you have that last name, I don't care, where you fit in the tree, that belongs to me.
Knowing what this group is doing is amazing, and to be a part of the group and to share in the experiences with the family that come and see the work that we've done and how much they appreciate it, to share the hugs and the tears and the joy when they're able to walk finally to their site that they couldn't do forever because the grass was literally, as tall as your chin. So that part of it is just amazing. And I would not do that because I know that this group is a great group and hopefully it will be around. I mean, this is our third upcoming season of working there and we have big plans.
I've met a lot of new friends, that are family to me now with the Friends of Eastern Cemetery. I can point people in directions now when they pull through and be like, this is the section you need to be in. Oh, I've seen that. I just cut around that gravestone.
I'm trying to get us to do more events, more tours, try to get schools involved, try to get more local groups involved, because there's such a great amount of history there. And the more people you bring in, the more people you talk to about it, they're going to tell more people. And I'm just hoping that raising that awareness can keep growing the nonprofit. And that's also how you can start fundraising, because the more people learn, the more that they do want to help.
We just need more help. We need more funding. We are a small group that is trying so hard to get the cemetery, not obviously back to where, it once was. You can't just recognize one person in that plot. It's not fair. But to get it back where families can come in and, be happy that it's being taken care of.
One of the things we would like to do, we were all young when my mother passed, and we would like to purchase a headstone. But at the time, what I do remember is my father, he was a bricklayer. And he wasn't paid much, but he put a red brick as a headstone to mark where they had laid her. And when we went back to try to find that, that's what we couldn't find.
With finding out about Greenwood's, abandonment situation, just like Eastern's, we thought it would be fitting to help them get a stone, because I guess they never were able to get a stone made for her. So we contacted Evans Monument Company, and they were willing to donate a gravestone for her. And so we got the burial records and the position of the burial plot for Mary Cobb, and we went over and set her stone so that when the family came on Memorial Day weekend or just before, they had a nice surprise waiting for them, rather than what they normally come there for and had to deal with.
Those are, it's our loved ones, and not only ours, but other people's loved ones. So I can speak for my family that we're truly grateful that someone cares. We were young back then, but we would like to be able to know where my mama is. I mean, we would like to put a headstone after all these years. It would mean a lot to us. It was 5 of us, 4 girls and a boy, and we don't even know where she's laid at there. We just know she's there.
Well, the cemetery is supposed to be the guardian, of deceased family members, and it's supposed to be a reverent place. You're not supposed to disturb graves.
You have who's who of Kentucky's history, and Louisville's history, buried back there. So why isn't anyone approaching those folks? There's no ownership. Until someone takes ownership of the property, I don't think you're going to get much of a change.
We can't take ownership of it, because if we take ownership of it, we inherit the liability, which in 1989, because of all of the pre-need sold graves, which right now they're supposed to be somewhere around 5,000. The estimate in 1989, after de Blasio and the Attorney General's office, kind of put all the resources together after reading the records and doing some archaeological digs, it was $59 million. And that's 1989 money.
We are going to make this work. It's going to work. This is not a 1-year plan. This is not a 10-year plan. This is a forever plan. This is a forever commitment, that we all, with Friends of Eastern Cemetery, have made.
There's just a lot of great people trying to do great things for families that some people don't even know. I mean, I have family there, but there are people there that there's no family there. They're just good people trying to do right by years and years and years of things that have gone wrong. And I just would hope that they would give us the chance to continue the good work that we're doing, because it is good work. And I just want people to know that we're there, and it's okay. It's okay,
Where long term, I want to see a memorial museum in there with every single name of every single person that we can find that was buried there, so that their family can come and at least see their name.
I put everything on the line. I said it before. I should have kept my mouth shut. I should have went looking, found me a job, and got away from it. They would have got busted sooner or later. It couldn't last forever. It lasted for the turn of the century up until 1989. So it had to end somewhere, and it would have ended. They would have hung themselves, and the outcome might have been different. If I wouldn't have did what I did, and I'd have left, they would have kept on going. Things would have got worse. Ronnie would have kept on doing what he was doing. Nothing would have changed. They'd have got caught, and chances are, that one would have stuck. Then something would have really happened to him. I could have just walked away.
This is a person who had a final wish, and they have a family who supports this final wish, who needs this ritual and this space to come and to be at peace with what happened to them in their life. And that's sort of lost. That's the part that I know. I just don't know how you get over that hump,
I don't know how widespread that is historically. I don't know whether it's a total criminal aberration or whether it was something that culture has done more frequently than we realize.
Things are never going to be right in Eastern Cemetery. And that's, I hope, it's obviously it's going to be there after I'm gone. I'm just hoping that people will not allow it to be abused over and over and over again. And all grave desecrations they had done, they had to prove one within a year. Remember, statute of limitations, 1 year. They could not find a case of overburial within a year. They would have had to gone through the records. They would have had to, this sort of stuff. They never were able to do that. They ended up charging, not with grave desecrations, not with things.
In a cave, praying to be saved, calling out to Mother Mary, asking for a raise. 4 nights on the road, coming back home. Travels in these soul-lit cities, bring about familiar pities and restless bros to just pose. The time will be gone. Perfect drums and pantomime, switching parts and pushing lines. The spotlight fades to pull the punch and say that life will roll on with its undercurrents and overtones, whistling winds through dried up bones. A mother with her arms wide open seems that you universe laughs in the face of those who dare to tackle grace and burn her midnight candles for a while. Drifting on the edge of time, a stone's throw from oblivion. You'll meet your shadow self face to face. You see that it's just fear and you embrace. And time will lead on with its perfect drums and pantomime, switching parts and pushing lines. The spotlight fades to pull the punch and say that life will roll on with its undercurrents and overtones, whistling winds through dried up bones. A mother with her arms wide open sings that you are not alone. She puts you on your knees as you're begging, darling, please release me so I can, baby, step away. She whispers back to me, magic mostly works in threes, and all you have to do is live to play, and the sun will rise to shine another day. Time will beat on with its perfect drums and pantomime, switching parts and pushing lines. The spotlight fades to pull the punch and say that life will roll on with its undercurrents and overtones, whistling winds through dried up bones. A mother with her arms wide open sings that you are not alone.
The only thing that I would really like to say is the way the families have been ripped off. I mean, hundreds, and I told Attorney General that. I said, these families bought these graves in good faith, knowing they had a place to go if something happened to them or something happened to their loved one. And then when the time comes, they're told there's no room. They can't use it. You know, that's not right. Thousands, there's got to be thousands of them out there, you know, that own property there that can't use it, you know, that pay for it. And they're not going to get their money back. They're not going to get another site to replace it. Their money's not there. I mean, they've been shafted, big time. And I think everybody turned their back on them. I think the Attorney General turned their back on them. They didn't go far enough to help them.